Good evening. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, TSTV channel 347. United States President Donald Trump is set to impose a 30% tariff on all South African goods as he continues with the enforcement of his reciprocal duties. Trump sent letters to various countries saying the new tariffs will take effect at the beginning of next month. He told President Cyril Ramaphosa that it is time to move away from the long-term and very persistent trade deficits enjoyed by South Africa through non-tariff policies and trade barriers. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome no stranger to News in Focus on Hilaal TV, Goolam Ballim. He is Standard Bank's chief economist. Goolam, always a pleasure having you on. Assalamu alaikum to you.
Walaikum salam, Faraz. Good seeing you again.
Absolute pleasure. Goolam, I don't think we should see this as a surprise. I mean, this was, of course, announced on Liberation Day, as Trump had termed it back in April. The 30%, we're not obviously one of those countries that have been hit quite high. But for the viewers out there who are maybe sitting and asking, is 30% quite a lot in terms of tariff on South African goods? Maybe can you break that down for us, please?
Well, in terms of the overnight signals by the President of the United States, it seems South Africa is in the middle of the range with respect to countries that he has imposed tariffs on, effective early next month. And by that I mean, if one looks, for example, at South Korea and Japan, they've received letters notifying them of a 25% tariff war, whereas other nations, many in the Far East as well, such as Myanmar, even Malaysia, have got rates of 35%. So at 30%, we're in the ballpark. We're broadly in the zone that other countries that have not reached conclusion with respect to a framework and equilibrium trading regime seem to have been invited to a tariff regime.
Goolam, so for the viewers out there, and I think it's important to break this down, this is, of course, going to mainly influence exports to the United States. So on that 30%, how much does it harm the export perspective of the country from 30%, given, of course, we're living in a world right now where the economies, especially of the global south, I beg your pardon, they're starting to pick up, but yet they're still on the back foot?
So some time ago, and perhaps the last time I spoke with you, we suggested that for a 10% effective tariff increase, and by effective we mean overall, even though there may be high tariffs, some products relief for some, lower tariffs for some, at a 10% effective tariff, we estimated that that would dent South Africa's GDP growth by 0.1 of a percentage point. So let's say that's the starting point. Over and above that, if we consider that 30% effective early August may not necessarily come to pass, in other words, over the remaining 3 weeks or so, we do anticipate that South Africa is hastily going to engage the United States with respect to a counter-tariff structure, something that has been on the boil, in the making, but South Africa hasn't quite concluded. So I think there's still some possibility that there is settlement and the end game delivers a still tariff increase, but at a less punitive rate of 30% generally applicable. But that said, I would just cast in terms of the numeracy, if it turns out that we are unable to avoid being assailed by the United States, and it lands effectively at the end with a 30% overarching tariff increase, then we anticipate that the damage to South Africa's GDP could vacillate between 0.3 and 0.4 of a percentage point. And I would just conclude at least this little question that you've asked by suggesting that at the beginning of this year, we estimated that South Africa could grow in 2025 by 1.8%. Given developments so far and just the general weakness in the global economy, we've lowered our GDP growth rate to an estimate of 1.1% for this year. And it does appear to potentially be facing even further downside risk given latest developments.
Yeah, I was going to come to that question, Goolam, with regards to the GDP. I mean, with this tariff hikes that are about to occur. What does this now do for the GDP? I mean, you and I have spoken at length. I think our first conversation this year was when the World Economic Forum had happened and Team South Africa were going out and saying, listen, we can grow by at least 1.5%. You mentioned it, even 1.8%. But I mean, when we close the year off, and I know we are still, 5.5 months away from that happening, what is the realistic expectation now with these tariff hikes for South Africa's GDP?
So everywhere, practically around the world, there are downward growth revisions. So South Africa is not a standout in that respect. But in line with the undertone to your question, South Africa, at least through our lens, revising its GDP growth rate from 1.8 to 1.1 does represent a fairly dramatic increase. In fact, of all the downgrades around the world, South Africa ranks about seventh in terms of the most meaningful, the most suppressed downgrade, the 0.7 of a percentage point from 1.8 to 1.1. So quite clearly for South Africa, this is dramatic. And it comes through two channels of transmission. One, of course, is the expectation that South Africa will ship less goods to the United States because of the tariff war. And of course, the goods that we make reference to here fall largely within the mining, farming, and automotive sector, which is the majority of items and goods that South Africa ships to the United States. The second channel for this growth suppression relates to an indirect path, and it's the manner in which the United States, through both the tariff war as well as just general uncertainty, is suppressing global GDP and particularly global commodity prices, which are a very significant conduit in South Africa's export basket. So lower commodity prices is a further channel of negative transmission to South Africa, rendering the possibility of a mere 1 percentage point or 1% growth in 2025. We do, however, think that there's still tailwinds, generally lower inflation, combined with robust real wage growth in South Africa, and a reasonably supportive credit environment given the interest rate relief South Africa has witnessed over the last few quarters provides some impetus for some level of resilience.
Goolam, the presidency has said that, look, they're going to still have dialogue with Washington to try and see if they can reduce these tariffs. I think both you and I know Donald Trump's a very stubborn U.S. president. It's going to be very difficult to try and go ahead and negotiate. But if there's one thing we saw, obviously, in May when President Ramaphosa went to the United States, is his ability to have this statesman-like a stature to him, that he can negotiate. I mean, this is the man that, of course, was part of the team that negotiated our democracy. So him going to Washington to try and reduce this, and I'm sure he'll be taking some heavyweights with him. I'm going to ask you to put your magic hat on, Goolam. Can he reduce it below 30%? If so, what is the realistic number that the government could be looking at to try and agree upon?
For us, there's perhaps two dimensions that I want to address. Prior to the Oval Office meeting between President Trump and President Ramaphosa's delegation, clearly tensions between South Africa and the United States were at a zenith. You will recall as well, early February, President Trump dispatched a letter, an executive order to South Africa. And that executive order was quite unique in that South Africa was the only country that, in addition to the imposition of tariffs, also received an executive order disparaging South Africa in a variety of areas, including domestic policies such as socioeconomic transformation and our international stance on Israel, for instance. Over the Oval Office meeting, to a degree, helped reset relations to a less searing level. And it definitely was positive to the extent that, at least after that, the capacity to begin to engage with the United States to find a new equilibrium with respect to trade. We also, over the recent past, have seen some level of dial down with respect to assailing South Africa for its ICJ position, even though I don't think that that necessarily has disappeared off Americans' radar, especially in Congress, where I think certain congressmen will continue to want to assail South Africa and hold South Africa to account through their judgment of South Africa's unwise policy position. But essentially, the temperature is a little cooler, while still, I would argue, fairly hot, comparatively cooler than the Oval Office meeting. And one does hope that the feverish work that the Department of Industry and Competition is engaging to attempt to put together a counter-narrative will bear some fruit.
Goolam, always a pleasure having you, and thank you so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to you.
Walaikum salam. Take care, Faraz.
That's Goolam Ballim, Standard Bank Chief Economist. Yeah, President Cyril Ramaphosa, a lot of work to try and make sure that tariff hikes can be decreased. Going to be a challenge for him, definitely. After the break, yesterday, Sibusiso Nkengwa, the man who pleaded guilty to the murder of former ANC Youth League Secretary General Sindiso Magaka, he was sentenced yesterday. We're going to be speaking to former ANC Youth League Deputy President Andile Lungisa with regards to this. Do stay tuned.